And we're ready to go. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our third Thursday program on Governor Phil Hoff and the election of 1962 with our speaker, Tony Lopez. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a program by the Vermont Historical Society. You're probably familiar with our work, but if you're not, we're the Historical Society for the state of Vermont. Our mission is to connect you to Vermont's shared story. And if you are not yet familiar with our website, you can see it on the screen right there, vermonthistory.org. Please check that out for any other upcoming programs. We have further programs in this third Thursday series, as well as some really exciting other programs and interactive classes, all of which are remote during this time. So please do check those out. We also have a lot of resources and other ways that you can connect with history at home, things you can watch, things you can listen to, some things you can do. There's a lot of great stuff going on, and make sure you check out vermonthistory.org for all of that information. It's my pleasure to begin our talk today. I'm going to end my screen share so that you can see our speaker in full screen. It's my pleasure, as I said, to welcome Tony Lopez here to speak about Governor Phil Hoff and the election of 1962. This was an absolutely seismic election within the political history of the state of Vermont, and Tony Lopez is here today to speak about his perspective on that election, which he gained through extensive interviews and conversations with both Governor Phil Hoff and Governor Keyser, as well as a number of other people in Governor Phil Hoff's circles. He had a long-time relationship with Governor Hoff, and as we were chatting before we started this program, wants to see him placed within his proper context and his importance within the history of the state of Vermont and the 20th century history of the state of Vermont especially. So we're going to hear Tony's perspective on that election today, and I'm going to change the microphone over to him now so he can begin his program.
Good afternoon. In November of 1962, two young men in a hurry were running for the governorship in Vermont. F. Keyser was age 35, and he was the incumbent Republican governor at that time. Philip Henderson Hoff, his challenger, the Democrat, who was the underdog, historically at least. Perhaps not so much so realistically. As we develop this story, perhaps that will come through. Now, the project that I was working on was titled Lights That Illuminate Our Future. But that title had changed. It started off being the Hoff years, Vermont in Transition. And how I came to be involved in this was through a serendipitous series of events which caused me to meet Governor Hoff, become interested in the election of 1962, and follow it a bit. So the story is from my own personal perspective. And there's a danger in that. And the danger is that suddenly I become the topic, and the election and the two candidates become secondary. So I look at my perspective as the picture frame of a picture. And the portrait is the history, the story. Now, any good picture framer knows that the frame should enhance the picture and not vice versa. So I have tried to accomplish that, and you can be the judge. Early on, I realized I needed some help once I had proposed this project to Governor Hoff initially, and later F. Keyser. So I reached out to one very old friend and one new friend. The very old friend was a Republican by the name of Theodore M. Reilly III. He's been in Vermont pretty much his whole life, not all of it. Well connected in Republican circles, especially the old ones, because his father was a contemporary of Philip Hoff's. And the other person I reached out to was a guy named Paul Gittleson at Videosyncrasies, who does video presentations for a living. I certainly don't know how to do it, but Paul definitely does. Now, also, I figured, well, we're going to need some money. Well, I'm a retired military guy, so I know how to spend money, but I don't necessarily know how to raise it. But Ted, however, does, or at least he knows people who do. So I suggested to Ted that we have a meeting with Governor Hoff, and he wholeheartedly agreed. And then I suggested to Governor Hoff that we meet with Ted. Governor Governor Hoff wasn't quite as enthusiastic as Ted, and I had to have a caution with Governor Hoff. He was in his 80s then. But he said, well, okay, Tony, if you really think it's necessary. And I said, well, kind of I do, because we're going to need some money, and I don't know how to go about that. And the list of candidates on my short list is one, so I don't have a lot of choices. Well, the day came for the meeting with Governor Hoff and Ted and myself, and I showed up early just to make sure that Governor Hoff was okay with it. By then, I had already assured Joan Hoff that I would have a caution with her husband's health, and I always had that in the front of my mind. But Governor Hoff was fine. He was an old politician, very smart man, very personable and very nice, and Ted arrived. Ted said, Phil. And Phil said, Ted. And I'm sitting there wondering, what's going on? But it seemed like we were okay. So Ted then said, Governor, I heard you had a dog. And Governor Hoff replied, yes, I had two. One was a nipper. To which Ted replied, I heard you trained it to bite Republicans. Governor Hoff, sitting back in his wingback chair, cocked his head a bit, smiled, and said, nope, didn't have to train her. Now, I wish I had a story like that for Ray Keyser, because fairness would dictate that I would, but I simply didn't get to know him that well, and that was unfortunate, and certainly not his fault. We are at 60 Washington Street in Barre, Vermont. Miss Amanda Gustin and I are going to tell you a story. 60 Washington Street in Barre is the home of the Barre Historical Society. However, back in the day, it was Spalding High School. And in this very room, Miss Bixby attempted for 2 years to teach me Latin. And I still don't know any Latin. So I've been around for a while. It was the 60s, and I don't think they teach Latin anymore. Well, I live down on 2nd Street, which is the north end of town where the granite sheds are and where the working folks lived. And I remember my mother, around 1955, I would have been 8 years old, complaining very bitterly about something called a poll tax. Now, perhaps history and Latin weren't my strong suit, but maybe geography was, because I thought, well, what's a poll tax? Is it a tax on Middle European immigrants? Perhaps. Or a levy on the public utilities? I didn't know. I didn't ask. But I, to this day, remember her complaint. Later on, Phil Hoff asked me what my motivation was. I told him that story, and he smiled. Well, a little time ran along, and an aunt and uncle of mine were having a discussion about a political contribution they had made in the hopes that he would get a job delivering mail up in Graniteville. Joe delivered the rural route for many years. It was 1962. Now, as a young lad, I had a bicycle, and I used to push it up the hill to the Knapp Airport. When I got up there, and I knew the schedule, I would watch the old DC-3 from Northeast Airlines land and take off. And then I would coast back down to Barre. Around 1989, as a matter of fact, the end of 1989, I retired from military flying, came back to Vermont, and went to work for an outfit called Metro Airlines Northeast. Their call sign was Northeast. The original Northeast, long gone, swallowed up by Delta. And I figured, close enough. So it turned out that in 1990, after the election that year, we gave Peter Smith, our then congressman, a ride from Burlington down to Washington National, now known as Reagan. On the return, we picked up Bernie. And as he came up the stairway to get into the airplane, I was standing in the companionway between the cockpit and the passenger compartment. And I commented to him that I thought we had done this backwards. To which he paused for a moment and said, what? Or words to that effect. And I said, well, we just gave Peter Smith a ride down to Washington and just gave you a ride, or giving you a ride back to Burlington, and you won. Well, Bernie tried to smile, but let's face it, it's not his strong suit. And then he went and found a seat, perhaps not wishing to suffer a fool gladly. Who knows? But in any case, Bernie came to Vermont. Why on earth did a guy with a brand new poli-sci degree from the University of Chicago come to Vermont? Well, I found out later on when I was invited to Phil Hoff's 80th birthday party. Actually, he was 81 at the time. It was a fundraiser for the Vermont Teacher Diversity Program. Well, I had no connection with Phil Hoff. I had no connection with Vermont Teacher Diversity Program. So I went and later figured out that in fact, they had invited my son. Now, it turned out shortly after that, that my son, Governor Hoff, and I were having lunch together. And my son, who's named Tony as well, thanked Governor Hoff for providing the Vermont Student Assistance Corporation, where he borrowed money to go to medical school. And he now practices up on a hill, very close to the old Knapp Field. So it's Vermont, it's a small place, and these coincidences coincide sometimes. In any event, I went to the party. I listened to Bernie give his speech, and Bernie explained that he came, the reason he ended up in Vermont was because of an election in 1962. I wrote a letter to Governor Hoff thanking him for inviting me to his party and decided to give him a little history lesson in German history, which I have a degree in, pointing out to him that in 1848, the German liberals took charge of what was then to become Germany. It wasn't really rationalized yet, but it would become Germany, and sent the Prussians back to Prussia with their guns. 1849 was a very bad year for German liberals, and the ones that got out of town quickly enough ended up in central Texas and other places. But the point was that Governor Hoff and his folks sometimes were a little too kind when they had the controls. So I got a note back from Phil Hoff. It said, "Tony, you seem like my sort of guy. Let's have lunch," which we did. I proposed a video project, and he agreed with some stipulations. But during that first lunch, he raised an issue. It had to do with a lawsuit that I was pursuing in the Federal District Court of Vermont. It was a manners lesson for some folks who somehow thought that Vermont wasn't part of the United States and wasn't controlled by federal law. They found out that they were. But Phil Hoff had brought up that topic, and it seemed like he knew something about it. And he was amused at my description, a rather flippant account of what I was up to. I was doing it pro se, so I didn't have a lawyer, but hey, if you can read, the law isn't that illogical. And so he then let me know in his way that we were fighting the same fight. Aha. It wasn't my note so much that caused me to have lunch with Governor Hoff. It's what I had been up to that interested him. Now, the video project itself was, he had 3 stipulations in order to go forward with that. And one was that he wanted context. He wanted people to understand what was going on in Vermont when he was elected governor and the 6 years that followed and what was accomplished during his terms. He had 3. I agreed to that because generally, as a military guy, that's the way we go about things anyhow, cross the T's and dot the I's. The second thing was there was a book Sam Hand and Steve Terry were working on. Now, the governor wasn't critical, but he said that the project seemed to be lufting. It was adrift. It wasn't moving very quickly, if at all, and he would like to see that it got done first before the video presentation. And I agreed to that with the caveat that, well, I can agree to that, Governor, but that doesn't mean I can't do anything. We've got to preserve the history because, come on, folks are getting old. They're not going to be around for on-camera interviews forever. And he said, yes, that makes sense. And then the third thing was he pointed out that his stamina wasn't what it used to be. And so I felt the soft hand of Joan Hoff immediately and made a mental note to put her at her ease as well. I came to know her well through visits to their home up at Prospect Parkway and later on when they moved from there down to Shelburne Bay. But 62 was a bellwether year, it seemed. I didn't know that much about it, but just a cursory look saying, wow, this was kind of a big deal. But I had to deal with the context. So I went back to Franklin Roosevelt's election of 1932. Well, that was 30 years before 62. I figured that was far enough. Back in those years, Maine was the indicator of who was going to win a presidential election. And so the wisdom went, as goes Maine, so goes the presidency. So if Maine went for the president, then the rest of the country would, and whoever Maine voted for would win. In 1932, Maine went for Herbert Hoover. That didn't work out so well. So 4 years roll along, 36 comes along. Now in 32, Maine and 5 other states voted for Hoover. 1936, Maine and 1 other state voted for a guy named Alf Landon. Now, perhaps the conventional wisdom should have been, if you're going to run for president, don't have a name like Alf. However, the wisdom of then became, as goes Maine, so goes Vermont. The point is, 26 years before 1962, Vermont was the reddest of red places. Very, very conservative, as was Maine. So I get a call from Governor Hoff, and he invites me to his home to meet some of his friends. Well, I showed up, and the stage was set. There was only one likely place for me to sit. So I sat there, wondering where the lion was, because there had to be one in the room. It was that I felt like the Christian in the Colosseum. There wasn't any reason for me to be there and meet his friends other than to determine whether or not we should proceed. Well, Sam Hand and Steve Terry were there. They were both very pleasant. They'd been working on their book. They asked me a couple of questions. Sam Hand was a professor emeritus at UVM in history, and he helped me a great deal as the project continued. Steve Terry was a newspaper man from back in the day, so he knew the politics from the reporter's angle. And then there was this gentleman sitting on my right on the same couch, about a backhand away. And he didn't let on as to who he was and what he was up to, except he was doing most of the questioning. He finally got to the point where he said, well, Tony, you seem like a nice guy, but you don't know what you're doing. And he was probably right. However, sitting across the room from me, listening very intently, was Governor Hoff. And the way to play this hand was not to agree with the gent sitting to my right. So I said to him, I think you're a lawyer. And so let me explain this in language you understand. Wrong on both counts. Well, out of my peripheral vision, I saw a big smile from that wingback chair. And the governor soon dismissed the lion to my right. He was a nice guy, and I met him a couple of times. He just had a chore to accomplish, and he did. He asked Steve Terry and my friend to the right to have a nice evening, and if Sam Hand and I could stick around. Governor Hoff and Sam Hand then started a discussion about governance. Now, governance, it came out, was a continuum. The problems were there. The solutions were optional, but in a rational world, the problems weren't. So that meant that if you were going to try to solve the problems as a governor, you needed some context. You needed to go back. You needed to find out what was going on. And in this particular case, the particular problem they were talking about was the production of electrical power in Vermont, because the demand was starting to outstrip the supply. So something was going to have to be done. And the two names that came up during that discussion were George Aiken and Ernest Gibson Jr. Now, George Aiken was a very successful politician in Vermont, two-time governor and senator for many years from our state. But back when he was the governor and before, George Aiken took the side of the hill farmers. And the hill farmers in Vermont had a rough row to hoe. If you were to read Joe Sherman's book, Fast Lane on a Dirt Road, he talks about his sister and their farm, her and her husband's farm above Tunbridge, Vermont, and how she always thought things would get better, but they never did. And George Aiken was their man. He did his best to take care of them. When the private utilities wanted to put up another dam and flood out some more farmers and timbering people, George Aiken was right there fighting the good fight. They remembered George Aiken. So when George Aiken ran for governor in 36 and again in 38, he won. And in 1940, in the beginning of 1940, Ernest Gibson Sr. died. Well, a lot of people died that year, but it just so happened that Ernest Gibson Sr. was a US Senator from Vermont, which meant Governor Aiken needed to appoint someone to fill in the time until there could be a special election, which would have been in November, some 8 or 9 months after Ernest Gibson Sr.'s death. So George Aiken reached out to Ernest Gibson's son, Ernest Gibson Jr. And Jr. took over his father's job for that interim period until January of 1941. So who was going to run for that Senate seat? Well, it wasn't Ernest Gibson Jr., as would normally have been the case. Nope, it was George Aiken. And George Aiken needed to have a primary fight before he got the Republican nomination. Even though he'd been the governor for 2 terms, he wasn't a traditional Republican governor. He was much more liberal than the standard fare from perhaps Proctor, Vermont, and other places. So there was a primary. Those hill farmers did not forget George Aiken, and he beat the more conservative challenger, Ralph Flanders, in the primary, which meant he was going to be the next US Senator from Vermont to finish off the term of Ernest Gibson Sr. Well, a primary in the Republican Party in Vermont was a strange thing because they had something called the Mountain Rule, which was designed to avoid primaries in Vermont, and yet we just had one. What was happening was George Aiken and later Ernest Gibson Jr. were splitting the Republican Party in Vermont. Now, Ernest Gibson Jr., after January of 1941, went back to work as a lawyer and part-time military guy. And then in December of 1941, there was a little event out in Pearl Harbor, which caused Ernest Gibson Jr. to put his uniform on, head out to the South Pacific, win the Silver Star and the Purple Heart. And as he was winning the Purple Heart, some photographers showed up, took a picture of him getting his head bandaged, and then he came home to Vermont. It's 1946. It's time for another governor's election. There is an incumbent Republican governor of the conservative variety named Mortimer Proctor. He has served 1 term, and he's up for his 2nd term. And here comes Ernest Gibson Jr. And he's going to have a primary for who's going to have the Republican nomination, and he takes it away from the sitting Republican governor. A big deal. So now we've had another primary in Vermont. The schism in the Republican Party is getting further and further split. Well, Ernest Gibson Jr. is also a young man in a hurry. He decides that it's time to work on the problem of highways, upgrading them in Vermont, of healthcare, which needed some attention, of education and welfare likewise. So he starts all of these programs through the legislature, and of course to pay for them he raises taxes. Oh, wait a minute, this guy's a Republican. Well, not really by the Vermont standard. So again, it's the schism is growing. The trajectory of the Republican Party is shifting. It's shifting to the left. And so the knowledgeable political people in the state are starting to notice this. Now, Sam Hand, in his book, The Star That Set, describes the decline of the Republican Party in Vermont, certainly much better than I ever could. However, it was recommended reading by a friend of mine named Greg Sanford, who was a state historian and archivist at the time. And so I immediately reached out to Greg as soon as I realized I was going to get involved in this. And he then pointed me in the direction of Sam Hand and other folks, Consuelo Northrop Bailey being another one, and we'll get to her in just a moment. But he describes Governor Keyser in his book as perhaps with not as soft a touch as he might have otherwise had. And I took that at face value and put it in an email to Governor Hoff, copied to several people, and my phone rang. Then it was Governor Hoff. And I remember he said, "Tony, do you realize that Ray Keyser is still alive? And oh, by the way, I want to maintain friendly relations with him." Oh, no, I didn't realize he was still alive. He was a Republican. They're usually 90 years old when they get elected governor. And so how could he possibly be alive? No, turns out Ray Keyser was the youngest man ever elected governor in Vermont, and perhaps in the United States. I'm not sure about that one. But anyhow, Ray Keyser was alive. So I now had another light. Lights that illuminate our future. We had one light, Phil Hoff. Now there's another light, Ray Keyser, but I got to get to him. I pick up the phone and call Ted Reilly, and a couple hours later, Ray Keyser calls me. Well, our initial conversation was about him appearing on camera, and he said he wasn't going to do it. Probably, mostly. Never going to happen, I don't think. I suspected the door wasn't completely slammed and locked in any case. I don't remember exactly what he said, but he wasn't enthusiastic. But then he was a politician, and he was a smart man. So, if you were to leave where we are right now and head down Route 302 and then south on 110, you'd come to Chelsea, Vermont, home of Ray Keyser and his father, who was also in politics. And Ray Keyser is the governor. Now, Governor Keyser, who unfortunately I didn't get to know as well as I did Governor Hoff, was very, very helpful to me. He didn't have as light a touch as Governor Hoff. He had a different personality, but he was every bit as pleasant as Governor Hoff in his own way. And I came to recognize that because I was used to it. That's kind of how I grew up, with people who were direct and to the point. So it didn't bother me any, because in my world, it saved time. Now, it came to pass that a fellow named David Anderson was the auditor of accounts during Ray Keyser's administration and for years before. And Ray Keyser had a device he used called the pre-audit, which kind of implies that the legislature passes a spending bill, then the governor signs it into law, and then David Anderson looks at it and decides whether he wants to spend the money or not. Well, Ray Keyser didn't operate that way. He figured he was the governor, and he wasn't going to go convince the auditor of accounts to let him spend some money, which was already appropriated into law. So that probably, and we don't know because I never got to speak to David Anderson, probably was something that he didn't like very much. Just guessing, just saying. I don't know. But here's what I do know. Shortly before the election day of 1962, Phil Hoff called a news conference, and he said, Governor Keyser didn't balance the budget. Governor Keyser came back and said, "Oh, yes, I did." And asked the auditor of accounts. So David Anderson was asked, and David Anderson said, "Yep, Governor, the candidate Hoff is correct. Governor Keyser did not balance the budget." Well, a serious bad hair day for Governor Keyser. I think everybody would agree, but we have to ask ourselves a question. Why would David Anderson do such a thing? Well, now we're up to the second on-camera interview with Phil Hoff at his home on Prospect Parkway. Paul Gittleson is setting up his camera, twiddling around with the audio and whatever else he was doing back there. I was sitting off camera to the right. Governor Hoff was getting adjusted in his big wingback chair, and he asked me, "You're going to ask me about David Anderson, aren't you?" And I said, "As a matter of fact, Governor, it is the first question." He never knew what I was going to ask him. We wanted the spontaneity. And he said, "Well, it was David Anderson who called me and alerted me to the fact that Ray Keyser hadn't balanced the budget." I said, "Oh, well, that's not off the record, Governor." He said, "No, it isn't." And immediately I knew. He's trying to help me establish a better bond with Ray Keyser so I can get him on camera. I said, well, okay. And we moved on. By then, Paul turned the camera on, and I went to question 2, because Governor Hoff knew me by then well enough to know I would not insult him by asking the same question again. And he was smart enough to give me what I wanted without doing it on camera. So now Ray Keyser is the governor, and the Rutland Railroad is going broke. So they call Ray Keyser up and say, would you give us some money? Give us some state money to stay in business. Ray Keyser's a conservative Republican. He's not going to give the Rutland Railroad any money, and he doesn't. And by the way, they're not around anymore. Asa Bloomer was a Republican senator from Rutland, known for a long memory and being able to carry a grudge. Asa Bloomer wanted to reapportion the Senate, which had been mandated by the Vermont Supreme Court in a particular way. Ray Keyser had a different plan. Guess who won? Asa Bloomer was unhappy. Now Ray Keyser's looking around the state, trying to save some money, looks up to the Northeast Kingdom, says, we got 2 state colleges, let's sell one of them, it can be Linden. Well, those folks up in the kingdom, they might not all have electricity, but they all had phones. So again, in the meantime, in the legislature, you had a group called the Young Turks, one of whom was Dick Mallory, who's noticing that Ray Keyser is way too friendly with the private utilities, who, according to Sam Hand's book, were not notably poor. And Dick Mallory, along with Phil Hoff, were wondering about that. And in the meantime, front row seat to all of this, who had just been elected in 1960 to the Vermont legislature, was Philip Henderson Hoff. The stage was set. Republican knives were out, and Ray Keyser was showing a whole bunch of exposed back with nobody to protect him. Now, we need to talk about a fellow named William Myers, because this plays into the whole story. 1958, William Myers wins 51.5% of the vote and becomes elected as congressman from Vermont. He was a Democrat. Phil Hoff wasn't the first guy in a statewide election to win office. It was William Myers, fair-haired boy of the Democrats, 1958, a non-presidential year. 1960 comes along, and William Myers, of course, is up, 2-year term. All the Hill farmers come down. They vote the straight Republican line, and William Myers is unemployed. Now, the Democrats had a candidate they were going to push really hard, all the chips on the table for the governor, Phil Hoff. 1962, not a presidential year. William Myers is now going to run for George Aiken's Senate seat. George Aiken is up in 1962. The Democrats have a problem. If William Myers, an energetic campaigner, starts calling George Aiken a bunch of names, George Aiken was going to put down his pencil, leave the barn, and come out and campaign. And all those Hill farmers were going to come out, and you can forget about Phil Hoff winning. So it's time to talk to, well, let me say that Ray Keyser, very well aware of this, had made a chart. Off presidential years, Democratic participation increasing, Republican participation decreasing. Those lines are going to cross, and his chart showed they were going to cross in 1962. So, does William Myers, fair-haired boy of the Democratic Party in 1962, get the nomination for the Senate to be candidate for the Democrats? He does not. Well, why not? Because all of the chips on the Democratic table were Phil Hoff's. Now, other things were happening in Vermont around 1960. It had been for a few years. WCAX-TV came on the air in 1954. IBM showed up in Vermont in 1957, started making chips. And by the way, paying people a little more than the wages had been around here. Interstate 89 opened up between Middlesex and Montpelier. The outside world was seeping across Lake Champlain in the Connecticut River Valley and across the Massachusetts border into the hills and gores and valleys of Vermont. We were starting to change. That change would turn into a torrent during the 6 years of the Hoff administration. Now, I mentioned the mountain rule earlier, and it's the second interview with Phil Hoff, and it's time to ask him a question. The next question: could you explain the mountain rule? Well, Governor Hoff said, oh yes, that was a Republican device to tamp down internal infighting within the Republican Party. Oh, very good. Okay, got it. Could you explain the still hunt and William Myers? Governor Hoff wasn't quite as enthusiastic about answering that question, but he did. He said, oh, well, I didn't have anything to do with William Myers. That was a decision of the Democratic National Party. But basically what it was we wanted to put our strong candidates out there in non-presidential years, and we moved on. So we had the Rutland Railroad. We had reapportionment. We had selling Linden State College. We had a charismatic challenger, and the perfect storm was forming for Ray Keyser. As if that were not enough, a couple of guys up in the Northeast Kingdom, Luke Crisp and T.G. Buckley of the Vermont Independent Party, formed the Vermont Independent Party, whose sole reason for being was to have a way for Republicans to vote for Phil Hoff without voting for a Democrat. So they were boring another hole below the waterline in Ray Keyser's boat. All the votes were counted. Republicans got 60,035 votes. Democrat Phil Hoff got 56,196 votes. So it seems like Ray Keyser won, except that the independent Democrats gave Phil Hoff another 1,900 votes, and the Vermont Independent Party put Phil Hoff over the top by 1,300 votes. So that's the story of the election of 1962. And if I have one regret about the project that really never got done, was that day when Ted asked Phil Hoff if he had a dog, that Paul wasn't there with his camera. We could have staged it, but it wouldn't have worked out the same. It just wouldn't have. So it was a very pleasant journey, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony. I know we have a number of attendees watching along. If you are watching along and if you have any questions or reactions or comments that you would like to share on the presentation, you can use either the chat function in this Zoom or that fancy little Q&A widget that the Zoom webinar also supplies. Please feel free to type away and address anything. What we'll do is I will then read the questions out to our presenter and he can address them. So please let me know if you have anything that you would like to address to our speaker. If not, I'll give you guys some time to type away and ponder. I do have one quick question, and then I'll switch the mic back over to our speaker. My question to address to you is, I had always understood that part of Governor Hoff's strength was in the growing population center in Chittenden County, that he had a core strength in Chittenden County already, and that the Vermont's population shift and growth within Chittenden County, perhaps related to IBM, as you described it, was part of that story. So I'm wondering if the governor ever addressed that, or if you had anything to say.
Well, he did not actually, and I never asked him about that. I'm giving a presentation on the election of 1962, so I guess logically folks might think that that I would have gotten a little bit deeper into it, but I did not. I was really looking for the larger story, and the larger story was, how did Vermont change from the reddest of red states to the bluest of blue? One could argue that that's what's happened. Although it certainly isn't that simple, and there's a lot more to it. So I really can't address that other than logically, yes, Chittenden County was growing. Yes, Phil Hoff was a representative from Chittenden County. And so logically, that would have played into it.
Great, thank you. It takes me a second to pull the microphone back to myself so everyone at home can hear me instead of straining to listen to me. Thanks. Yeah. it's interesting on, some of the things that you bring up, questions of reapportionment and the Young Turks and things like that. A number of years ago, the Vermont Historical Society did a big project on the 1970s in Vermont, and we had looked at a number of factors that happened through the 1960s that led to what a lot of people consider sort of a revolutionary decade for Vermont, the 1970s, and the growth of the back up to the land movement and things like that. So just tying it in with other work the Vermont Historical Society has done, I absolutely agree with you that the shift to elect Phil Hoff and then his administration absolutely was a huge part of this shift in Vermont, changing its political stripes, as it were, along with obviously national factors affecting both the Republican and the Democratic parties. But I think not enough people realize that, as you set the stage, in the 1930s, Vermont was among the reddest states in the country, and that's useful perspective and context to have for the history of Vermont.